Many people can decipher you the myth of Abner Doubleday, and they can also tell you the story of the New York Knickerbockers and Alexander Cartwright and how they wrote down the rules of what became the modern baseball game. So it's not surprising that many people consider New York to be the birthplace of baseball. But what if I told you that a Philadelphia ball club existed before the 1839 date, which is often given as the year that baseball was invented? Philadelphia Baseball History presents the Olympic Ball Club of Philadelphia and the Origins of Baseball. We have documentary evidence of a Philadelphia club that played baseball as early as 1831. This was called the Olympic Ball Club of Philadelphia. It was a group comprised mostly of 20-year-old men who would look for a field to go play a ball game in. Now let's get some terms clear. Baseball is a two-word generic term which dates back at least to 18th century England that describes a game that involves throwing a ball at another team with a player who uses a bat to try to hit it and then running around bases before the other team can call him out. Now the bases were typically marked by wooden stakes, and in many instances the player would be called out by throwing the ball at the person. Well, at least up until the time that the Knickerbockers wrote down their rules, which involved tagging a person out with the ball. Of course, we should note that in those days the ball was a lot softer than what we know today. The ball was essentially a leather covering over a bunch of cloths. But it's not likely that any one event caused a group of players to sit down and write out the rules and call this a new sport called baseball. It's much more likely that baseball evolved from a group of similar games. Think of American football. Football came from the same origin that gave us such sports as rugby, Australian football, and even soccer. So it's logical that baseball did the same. And we all know that there are more than one sport that involves throwing a ball at somebody holding a bat who tries to hit it. Most of us are familiar with the game of cricket, which is still being played today and is popular in many former British colonies. And cricket shares some terminology with baseball. You've got a bat, you've got a batsman, or as we call it, a batter. You have players that switch between offense and defense, and those are called innings, and you have outs. Moreover, many of the early baseball players in the 19th century started off playing cricket. Think, for example, of Al Reach of the Athletic Baseball Club of Philadelphia. He started off as a cricket star who turned to baseball. And in the early 19th century, we know that town ball was a popular sport in America. We know that town ball involved a bat, a ball, and bases, sometimes 2, sometimes 6. They were equally distanced and marked by a wooden stake. Town ball was probably the most popular of the bat and ball sports played in the Americas in the early 19th century, and each region had their own version of the game. So there was a New England game, there was a New York game, and there was a Philadelphia game. And we know about rounders. This was a popular game for children in England. This game is still played today in England. You can find examples of it on YouTube. And if you see those videos, it looks an awful lot like baseball. So let's talk a little bit about what we know about the origin of the sport and how we came to believe the Abner Doubleday myth. So in 1874, Henry Wright, who was the man behind the creation of the Cincinnati Red Stockings team, took his Boston Red Stockings of the National Association on a tour of his home country of England. His goal was to show off this great new American sport to his home country. And on this tour, he took with him the second best team in the United States at the time, and that was the Athletic Baseball Club of Philadelphia. So together, they toured England from Liverpool to London to Surrey to Dublin, Ireland, in order to demonstrate how great this wonderful new sport of baseball was. But attendance at many of the matches was low, and those who did attend were not very much impressed. The spectators could be heard saying things like, "Oh, that's just rounders." And this traumatized Spalding pretty much for the rest of his life. So in 1888, Spalding was again involved in a tour to exhibit baseball to the rest of the world. It was a tour that brought baseball essentially to the foot of the Sphinx in Egypt. And there was a celebratory dinner afterwards held in the United States that was attended by many baseball pioneers, as well as popular Americans such as Samuel Clemens and Teddy Roosevelt. And from time to time, the attendees at this dinner broke out into cheers of "No Rounders, no Rounders." In 1903, Henry Chadwick, who is known as the father of baseball because of how he popularized the sport through his newspaper writings, wrote an article where he traced the origins of baseball back to rounders. The baseball world was appalled. So Chadwick and Spalding put together a commission in 1905 to investigate the origins of the American sport of baseball. This was called the Mills Commission, after its chairman, Abraham Mills, who was a former president of the National League. And among the members of the Mills Commission was Al Reach, who had gone on to become the first owner of the Philadelphia Phillies, as well as a sporting goods magnate himself. In fact, Reach supplied the baseballs to the American League. Now, the Mills Commission reached its conclusion, and in doing so, relied very heavily on a letter from a California mine engineer known as Abner Groves. That letter recalled a personal memory that Civil War hero General Abner Doubleday taught a sport known as baseball to students in the town of Cooperstown, New York, somewhere between 1839 and 1841. So the commission concluded that baseball was purely an American invention dating back to Abner Doubleday in Cooperstown in 1839. Now, mind you, we now know that this was not true. Doubleday was a cadet at West Point at this time. But this began the New York-centric attitude of the sport that continues to this day. In fact, in the mid-1860s, even though many people believed that the Athletic Club of Philadelphia was the best baseball club in the country, the teams from New York conspired to make sure that the Athletic never really had a chance to play for the national championship. That is until 1867, when the Athletic Baseball Club of Philadelphia claimed the national championship from the Brooklyn Atlantics after Philadelphia beat Brooklyn soundly in Game 1 of a 3-game series, and Brooklyn essentially forfeited the second game. And it is true that the game we now know as baseball can trace its roots to the set of rules that were written down by Alexander Cartwright when he played for the New York Knickerbockers. But we can't say that baseball was definitely and absolutely created at that spot at that time. It was more like an evolutionary process that involved the playing of town ball in the East Coast cities of the United States in the 19th century. And yes, the New York rules became the more popular rules and were standardized as the game of baseball in the 1850s. And we know that the Olympic Ball Club of Philadelphia switched to the New York game in 1860. We also know that the Olympic Ball Club shares many of the same characteristics as many of the early baseball clubs that popped up not only in New York but in other cities in the 1840s and 1850s. It was comprised mostly of young men who had sedentary jobs who were looking for a form of exercise outside. Now, these were upper-class individuals who had jobs where they had flexible hours and could choose when they worked and when they had their leisure time, so they had time during the day to find a field and play ball. And much like the clubs from New York City and Brooklyn, they found that their own city was rather dense and didn't have as much open field as they would have liked. So they got on a boat and traveled across the river, this time to Camden as opposed to Hoboken, to find a place to play ball. And we have documentary evidence. We know that by 1833 there was a written constitution setting down the rules for membership and the operation of the Olympic Ball Club. We also have at least one copy of a pamphlet from the Olympic Ball Club describing what they did. And in addition, we have a photograph showing the Olympic Ball Club's clubhouse as it existed in Camden around 1860. And the whole point of this is simply to show that Philadelphia played an important role in developing the bat and ball game that evolved into the billion-dollar sport that we now know as baseball. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you have any ideas for topics that we can cover in the future, please let us know in the comments below. We have new t-shirt designs, including the Philadelphia Athletics and Harry Stovey of the American Association. And don't forget to show your pride as you protect your health and that of your family. We now have masks available in our merch store. We'll have a link in the description box below. If you would like to see more of these videos, please consider becoming a patron through Patreon. Again, we'll have a link in the description box below.